Thank you to the organizers for putting me in the program. I am Mateo Uribe-Castro. You can find the full paper in my website listed there. And so my paper, and let me just give you a very quick in kind of pitch or introduction. There's this big question in development economics where the first wave of globalization led to huge increase in agricultural exports, and whether this increase in agricultural export for countries that had not industrialized helped leverage to expand manufacturing and services. For example, if income increases and the demand for local manufacturing increases, or if the agricultural sector has linkages or investment complementarities with manufacturing, or if in the contrary, this increase in exports delay industrialization in some way. For example, if resources and factors shifted away from manufacturing and services and into agriculture. And so I empirically study this question by studying Colombia's expansion of coffee cultivation and what effect did it have in the structural transformation of local economies. As you can see in the graph, around 1910 to 1920, coffee exports really picked up in the country for a variety of reasons. There was a peaceful period, the Panama Canal opened, and other unrelated price of coffee grew up. And so what I do is track over the 20th century counties that move into coffee cultivation, which are here, just this is very basic average share of labor force in manufacturing and services. 4 counties that move into coffee cultivation, that's blue and green, and 4 counties that did not move into coffee cultivation, which is the black and gray line. And this is basically just average using a variety of census. Some of them I digitize, the later ones are available. And so what I show in the paper is that counties that move into coffee cultivation by 1920 developed or less manufacturing and less services, so have a very different pattern of structural transformation. And basically, most of the first part of the paper is trying to answer, was it really coffee cultivation? Or maybe it's just that coffee counties that adopted coffee cultivation are very different than other counties. And so what I do is I instrument coffee cultivation using climatic factors specific to coffee, but then I also exploit the fact that in Colombia, suitability for coffee is driven a lot by altitude, which is driving climate a lot. And so the way that information spread out about which places could produce coffee and which places could not led to this discontinuity around 2,400 meters over the sea level, of which places ended up being more likely to produce coffee than not. And so then this next part of the paper, I answer why did this happen? And so why did this coffee boom slow down structural transformation? And again, this is very simple summary statistics showing each dot shows for each cohort born between 1900 and 1950, the difference in average schooling between people born in coffee places and people born in non-coffee places. This is just taking the 1973 census and doing this very simple summary statistic. And you can see that people born at the beginning of the century, before coffee really started to pick up, had relatively the same level of schooling, regardless of whether they were born in a coffee county or not. But later on, people born in coffee counties shifted out of, or children born in coffee counties shifted out of education, and the labor force in coffee counties became less educated. And this is basically because the production function of coffee is very amenable for child labor. You just need to pick the cherries manually, or you need to classify them. And so in summary, the opportunity to export a labor-intensive crop that was amenable for child labor shifted the labor force outside of education. And these differences in labor forces education between counties determine differences in the local processes of structural transformation. And therefore, I show in the paper that coffee cultivation slowed down the process of a structural transformation, reduced the rate at which local economies industrialized. And I show that this effect is actually concentrated in subsectors in manufacturing that are intensive in human capital. At this time, early 20th century, was beverages or printing or chemicals, stuff like that. And I show that these differences in patterns of a structural transformation over the 20th century led to counties that move into coffee cultivation early on, which is a great boom in the short term, are today are relatively poorer and less urbanized than counties that did not. So that's basically kind of like a snapshot of the paper, and I'm more than happy to take questions or reactions from the audience.
A first question that comes to mind is, you said it's typically in high altitude places that coffee is grown. So wouldn't these places be relatively less amenable to urbanization and manufacturing?
So it's actually, so there is this balance between altitude. So you can grow coffee between 800 meters and 2400 meters. So the very, very high places, you cannot actually grow coffee very successfully. It's kind of like in the middle. But Colombia is a country really, Bogota, for example, the capital is at 2600 meters over the sea level. So the more urban places are actually located in high altitude, but that's precisely what I do with my regression discontinuity design, which is, let me compare places that are high up in the mountains, but some of them are above this threshold, 2400 meters, which is a threshold that is more or less driven by climate, but it's also driven by a lot of the campaigns at the beginning of the 20th century trying to get people to grow coffee, that said, look, you can grow coffee well until 2400 meters, and it created this kind of discontinuity, and that's what I'm exploiting. So it's basically the concern that you have is like, we have these two places that are very high, but for some idiosyncratic reasons, the ones that are above 2400 meters did not end up shifting so much. So if there are no more questions, I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about the paper then. So I think the bigger or the most important part of the paper is me showing this link between the human capital of the cohorts that were exposed to these coffee booms and the human capital of cohorts that were not. And so what I do is basically that I observe adults in the 1973 census, and some of them were born in cohorts where when they started to be of a school age, the coffee price was high. And some of them were born in cohorts that when they were of a school age, the coffee price was low. So I exploit this kind of similar to a difference in different settings where I compare people born in places that grow coffee, that move into coffee cultivation, and were of a school age when the coffee price was high. So these people were less likely to, or developed, stayed less years in school. And as a consequence, they were less likely to participate in or to be employed when they are adults in manufacturing. And so I do some mediation analysis, and I showed that around 70% of the effect of coffee price shocks on manufacturing, or the likelihood of being employed in manufacturing, can be attributed to the effect of coffee price shocks on the years of education that a person or a cohort in this case adopts. And so I think I do like separate the paper in these two parts that I told you. The first part is more descriptive and trying to identify very well at the county level how did the labor force in the share of the labor force in manufacturing develop and services develop over the 20th century. But I think the most important part is connecting the fact that coffee provided an incentive for people not to send their kids to school and have them help in the farm, and that allowed for the labor force to be less likely to shift into manufacturing and services later on.
Hi, Mateo. Super interesting. One question: is internal migration a factor here? So does this contribute to the findings? So do you see people with, say, relatively more schooling migrating out from these counties, and how big is this?
Great. Yeah, that's a concern that I had coming on into this project. I think part of what happens in internal migration in Colombia, it's mostly like later 20th century phenomenon, so not very prevalent in the earlier part of the century. And also in the census, a very rough measure that I can check is whether you say you were born in a county that is different from the county where you're answering the census at. And around, for the 1973 census, which is kind of right around the time when manufacturing as a share of labor force peaked in the country, this was around 90% of the people that were born in the same county that they were filing the census on. Part of it is driven by geography and information frictions, but I also check, and in fact, if you kind of estimate this difference of whether if you were born in a coffee place where the price was high, are you less likely to migrate? And that also happens to be true. So it's in fact happens that if you're a kid that were born in a good coffee price year, you're more likely to work in the coffee sector and stay in the town where you grew up. Whereas if the coffee is low, you're more likely to finish elementary school or finish some schooling, and you're a little bit more likely to migrate. So I think both of those things are coming on.
It seems a lot of Latin and South American countries had restrictive labor market institutions and coercive labor market institutions. Does that apply to Colombia? In other words, should I think of this as being people individually and rationally deciding I'm not going to go to school? Or is it that the government didn't build schools for the children to go to and the local landowners coerced the children and their parents made them go and so on and so forth?
Yes, that's a great point. I think so. Coffee is very specific in Colombia because it's like it develops later than, for example, in Brazil. In Brazil, coffee is more related to farmers that used to be slave owners and then move into coffee. That is not the case for Colombia, but in fact, there is very restrictive labor markets. So what I do in the paper is maybe try to get a little bit at your question of whether is this just driven by parents' demand for schooling for their kids, or is this just like a supply of schooling? And so I think I find a little bit of both. So on the demand side, I find that, so you can take coffee counties that are a high inequality of land tenure of coffee. So you think about it as county where there is just one farmer that produces coffee versus there's other counties where you have coffee land spread out in many small landowners. And so the effect of coffee price shocks on schooling of kids is higher on the more equal places, right? And so I take that as maybe it's the case that in more equal places, landowners compete more for coffee, and coffee price shocks transfer more to wages and creates a more incentive. But then what I also show in the paper is that the construction of public schools, it's growing, of course, over the 20th century, but it grows at a slower pace in coffee counties in general, but also specifically in the high inequality counties. So it may be a couple of both things coming on. It may be on the demand side, parents are less likely to send their kids to school because the wages are high, and this substitute opportunity cost of schooling dominates kind of the income effect of families being richer because there's a coffee boom. But then on the other side, it also seems that in high inequality places where there's one or two landowners, and this is where my research agenda is going, working on trying to see whether coffee also provided for revenue for the government to do more schools. It doesn't seem like that in the high inequality places, high land inequality places, they built less schools at a slower rate than in the coffee, but by high equality of land tenure. But great, thank you for the question.
One very quick final question. In the discussion of your results, do you link your results to this debate on industries without smokestack? Because the implication would be that those agribusinesses, high productive agriculture, can actually not take the role manufacturing played in the past, right? Or don't you enter this debate at all?
So I think we run out of time, but let me try and answer quickly. I haven't considered much of the debate that you mentioned, so thank you for the comment. I'll look a little bit more into it. I think at the beginning of the 20th century, especially, the state wasn't very involved with promoting manufacturing, was mostly involved with just promoting exports as a kind of development mindset or model. And so this import substitution and so on only comes until the 60s and 70s in Colombia. So I think it's kind of like a lag, maybe part of it. And so I need to look a little bit more into that. Thanks.